Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm going to be looking at the costs for taking Mephisto from level 60 to level 70, including max gears. And since I'm a little bit late reviewing this character, I'm going to be looking at how he performs at 60 versus 70, as well as how he holds up to the other native tier 3, i.e. Knull, and whether his giant form stance or his PvE stance and rotation is that much better than the PvP one. Similar to my other videos, I'll be testing in all the various PvE and PvP modes, including Alliance Battle Extreme, Squad Battle, World Boss Ultimate Thanos, World Boss Legend Knull, and GBR Galactus. I believe I also have some testing on high stages of Shadowland, but besides that I'll also be looking at how he does in Timeline and Alliance Conquest, as well as providing suggestions on how to team him up in those modes. My card stats are the same as before, so around 110 attack and about 13% pierce. Last thing to note, all the testing here is done with a PvP build, i.e. the CTP of regeneration. So if you're trying to use him for PvE, just keep in mind that he can push way higher with a PvE build, so using something like a CTP of Judgment, for example, or even a Rage. On the PvP side, however, regen works great, and Authority isn't too far off. Things like Destruction or Greed won't really work as great because his base damage is pretty high, as you'll see. But yeah, without further ado, let's get into the results. Obviously, before you can even start to upgrade his character to level 70, you need to first unlock his potential. After you've done that, it'll cost you 80 CCF to get his potential from 60 to 62, or 111 Essence of Dimension, or 91 Titan component packs. Since I'll be exclusively using the 10% method, like I did for Knull, I don't know how much it's going to cost me, but hopefully it'll cost me less than if I use the 100% method, at least for the T3 materials. I know it's more than likely going to cost me more in terms of gold. I'm going to be speeding through the attempts so the video doesn't get too long, but for the first level of enhancement, I basically saved some CCF and gold and got it in 7 tries. In terms of upgrading the character from 60 to 70, the costs are pretty standard, they're the same as Knull. And you can see I posted them here, so if you're using BIOS, which I highly recommend, it would cost you around 6,500 to get him from 60 to 70. And for each level in between, you can also see the cost, so going to 62, 64, 66, 68, and 70. Similarly, the cost for using rank 1 BAM is posted on the right side, and you can see the total is 5,004. Although it might be better to use the black antimatter if you have a lot of it, you never know when an update comes around that updates a lot of native tier 2 characters, which is pretty much what we're getting with the next one that fully upgrades the Black Order. So that's 5 native tier 2 characters. All in all, I'd say it's safer to use the BIOS, but it always depends on your resource count, so use what you have the most of. Anyways, since I already posted all the upgrade costs, I'm going to be skipping it in the video and just showing the cost for upgrading the potential. In the second level of potential enhancement, I got pretty lucky and I got it in 2 tries of 10%. Unfortunately for the third potential level, I got pretty unlucky and it took me 19 tries to get it unlocked. At this point you might be thinking, oh, you've made a huge mistake. But I won't know for sure until I've finished all the enhancements, since you never know using the 10% method. I might get lucky later on. That said, even though it took me 19 tries, I still ended up using only 8 CCF more than if I used the 100% method, but I did end up using 2 times more gold, so about 5 million instead of 2.25 million. The fourth level wasn't nearly as bad, and it took me 11 attempts in order to unlock the potential there. I did end up saving about 100 CCF here, but did spend more gold, roughly about 2 million more. For the final potential level, I thought I was going to be in trouble since I was already a little bit behind in terms of gold and not too far off in terms of CCF cost. I was hoping to get this in 5 to maybe 10 tries at most, but after I pressed upgrade, the most magical thing happened. I got it in 1 try! That's right, it took only 1 attempt to unlock the most expensive potential level enhancement. So I need more footage to talk over. Here's that glorious moment one more time. Keep in mind that I got super lucky, so this probably won't be your experience with the 10% method, so use it at your own caution. That said, with that crazy finish at the end there, after 40 attempts, I ended up saving 887 CCF and surprisingly even 720,000 gold. Before I roll my luck and upgrade all the gears to 25, you can see how much CCF, Essence of Dimension, and Titan component packs I have to compare to how much I have at the end. The gear upgrades didn't go as badly as I expected, And I think the worst that I got was a times 25, and I only got times 20 about 4 times, the rest were around 15-ish. So you can see from my material count here, upgrading all the gears from 20 to 25 cost 1035 CCF, 2422 Essence of Dimension and Titan component packs, and about 20 million gold. Since I was going for a rank 1 build, I also had to increase his type enhancement to level 6, and luckily I was able to do that after 4 attempts on the very last level. You can quickly see my stats here, so I'm basically capped out on everything, even with a PvP build. And to summarize, in total it took me about 36 million to upgrade all the gears, potential, and type enhancement to max level. Compared to stats at level 60, at level 70, Mephisto essentially gains 5,500 energy attack, about 5,000 physical energy defense, and roughly 15,000 HP. Now that all the upgrades are out of the way, I can look at the more interesting part, which is how he performs in all the different content. Starting with ABX, on the Blast Villain Day, and at level 60, he can score about 4 million, again with no damage proc. Then on the No Restrictions Day, he can score about 7.6 to 7.7 million, which I have to say is pretty impressive at level 60. He essentially does better at level 60 without a damage proc than some characters at 70 with a damage proc. Taking him to level 70, you can then bump up your score on Blast Villain Day up by about 1 million to roughly around 5 million. And similarly on the No Restrictions Day, you can bump it up about 600 to 700,000, roughly around the 8.4 million mark. If you're wondering how that compares to Knull, it's almost exactly the same score, so I was at about 8.3 million with Mephisto, whereas for Knull I'm at around the 8 million mark. And that difference in score can come down to basically how quickly I accumulate and if I can tighten up the skill rotations a bit. But they're essentially the same. However, with that said, if you were to use the damage proc, Knull might get an edge here since he has an infinite skill and you can make full use out of the 5 seconds of a damage proc to a single skill. If you're using Mephisto in the No Restrictions fight in squad battle, he should be able to net you the 800,000 points for the last reward pretty easily. Even at level 60, I was able to get to 1 million points. Then at level 70, you can avoid all the penalties and essentially double or even triple your score. If you're going for a top 3 spot on the leaderboard for the extra rewards, I can't really tell you what his peak would be with a damage proc, but considering that his base damage is so high, I would say on the No Restrictions slot, he should be able to do pretty well. Before I look at how he does in World Boss, I wanted to quickly show how great his Striker passive is. I believe it's currently the only Striker passive in the game that provides a greater damage increase than 12%. It is typed as fire damage, so unfortunately you can't use it for everyone, but for characters like Ghost Rider and Torch, it's an amazing passive to have, especially because it activates when attacking. Like my other videos, I'm first testing on Thanos because it provides a better representation of the raw damage that a character has, because the all defense down is limited to only half of the fight. When he was at level 60, I obviously couldn't test him in Knull or his own Mephisto stage, so Thanos is the next best option, and it allows me to show how much better the character gets from 60 to 70. Didn't bother testing the character versus other world bosses like Ebony Maw, Cull Obsidian, or Corvus, since he can easily do stage 99 even at 60. And the reason for this is because he can consistently apply all defense down and has high base damage. I don't have stage 99 of World Boss Ultimate Apocalypse unlocked, but if I were to take him there, I'm sure he would easily be able to take that down as well, since he has a type advantage being Blast versus Combat. Anyways, as you can already see from this clip, I am first testing Mephisto at level 60 versus stage 80 of Thanos with no strikers. If you're wondering what rotation I'm using, I immediately go into the giant form, so pressing the 3rd skill. Then I stay in that stance for the damage accumulation on the 5th skill. That said, I go immediately into the 5th skill, cancel that into the 1st, cancel into the 2nd, and then delay cancel that into the 4th. When you have your ultimate ready, you essentially do the same rotation, but you start off with ultimate skill first, and you can cancel that right away into the rotation. I was experimenting with using the 5th skill before you use your ultimate, but I think it's better to use your ultimate first because then your meter goes back down to 0 and you can fill it up with your skills right away. And I don't think it takes away from the damage accumulation on the 5th skill, since the 6th skill takes a bit of time to wind up into the big damage. Anyways, at level 60, I was able to finish stage 80 of Thanos with 1 minute and 20 seconds remaining.
Although the giant form stance is designed to be better for PvE, considering that the 5th skill provides a massive damage accumulation buff to all your skills, I wanted to see how close the other stance was, i.e. the normal form or the PvP stance, and the same content for PvE. The rotation I used this time around was pretty simple. I spammed all the skills, and would only use the 3rd skill when it was off cooldown and my ultimate wasn't ready. If my ultimate was already filled and I was in giant form stance, I would just stay in that stance, so I would also get the damage accumulation from the 5th skill. You'd think that this rotation would be much worse than the other one, considering that oftentimes you could be in the wrong stance, so in the normal form, and miss that huge damage buff from the 5th skill. However, this didn't really seem to be the case, and this rotation wasn't actually that much worse than the other one. I believe that the reason for this is because the 3rd skill provides damage to villains when in normal form and heroes when in giant form. And as you might be already aware, the majority of bosses in World Boss Ultimate are villains, so if you're in the normal form, you'll get that benefit from the 3rd skill, whereas if you were in the giant form, you won't, because it only benefits versus heroes. On top of that, since you're rapidly spamming your skills, you fill up your ultimate more often, and considering that it does a large amount of damage, it makes up for that damage buff that's missed on the 5th skill. So if you're casually using Mephisto in ABX or squad battle, you shouldn't worry about it too much if you miss your usual rotation, since this stance won't set you back too much. Anyways, with that said, I only finished 5 seconds slower using this kind of random chaotic rotation than just using the PvE only rotation or the giant form stance. Sticking with the results from the PvE stance, using the same thing in this test, and upgrading Mephisto to level 70 in max gears, I was able to essentially shave off a full minute from the same fight. If you're wondering how Knull compares with the exact same team, I was able to finish the fight with about 2 minutes remaining. And although this is clearly slower, Knull does have his own leadership, so the benefit of that is that I don't have to use the same team and I can use 2 supports and his own leadership. And that's exactly what I do in this next test, and ironically enough, I finished with the exact same finish time as Mephisto. You might be thinking from these results so far that these 2 characters are pretty evenly matched, but you need to take into consideration that half of the Thanos fight is affected by all defense down, and since Knull only has Pierce and no all defense down, whereas Mephisto does have all defense down but no Pierce, that Mephisto gets an edge in these fights. But you don't have to take my word for it, since I took both characters into content that isn't affected by all defense down, so namely that's Giant Boss Raid Galactus and World Boss Legend Knull. In this first test, thanks to Mercenary and Hulks, I was able to take Mephisto at level 60 and solo clear Galactus. Even for all the penalties for not being level 70, I was still able to finish the fight in about 2 minutes and 50 seconds. Which again, I have to say, with no damage proc and at 60, that's pretty impressive. Then by maxing the character out, I was able to complete the same content a full 2 minutes faster. Just for perspective, like I did in the World Boss Ultimate test earlier, I used the PvP stance to see how much worse it is, and it was only 20 seconds behind the PvE stance. So that's not too bad if you ask me. Comparing Knull to Mephisto's PvE Galactus test, the one that I finished in about a minute, Knull essentially finished with the exact same time, being only a few seconds apart. But that comes down to rotation and with the boss interrupting you with their animations. Even though you might think that this test clearly means that the 2 characters are in fact pretty close together in terms of raw damage, this fight is a little bit too quick to determine that. So as a result, I also took the characters into World Boss Legend Knull, which has more health and can give a more accurate result. So taking Mephisto into stage 9 of Knull, using Thanos as a lead and Valkyrie as a support, I was able to complete the stage with about 1 minute and 10 seconds remaining, and that is using the PvE stance or the giant form. Again, to reiterate my point that the PvP stance isn't that far off from the PvE one, using the normal form, I was able to complete the same stage with 56 seconds remaining, which was about 15 seconds slower. So what this means is that if you want to use the character on auto in PvE modes, such as squad battle or dispatch, you shouldn't be too worried that the character isn't going to score enough or that they're not going to complete the stage in a certain amount of time. Using the exact same leadership, support, and strikers, I take Knull into the same stage to see how he does in comparison to Mephisto and his PvE only stance. As I suspected earlier, he completes the same content 17 seconds quicker, and that takes into consideration the fact that he isn't using another support and Thanos' leadership instead of his own leadership. If that didn't already prove that Knull performs better in content that doesn't require all defense down, then this final test surely does. So by taking advantage of his own leadership and adding in another support, he completes the same content almost a full minute quicker than Mephisto. Although it's clear that Knull performs better in content that doesn't require all defense down, the inverse is also true. Mephisto performs better than Knull in content that he can take advantage of using all defense down. So to make this point clear, I took both characters into a high stage of Shadowland, so the one that I tested on was stage 124. And you can see that with Mephisto, it took me about 1 minute to complete this content, whereas for Knull, it took me almost 2 minutes to complete the same content. And keep in mind that that's with Knull's own damage leadership, whereas Mephisto had no damage leadership at all. I know that Mephisto gets 30% fire damage increase with his own leadership, but that only activates when he's debuffed, and considering that I had the boss locked down, that would never activate. So who should you build first? Well, if you're trying to push to a higher stage of the regular world boss ultimate stages and Shadowland, then Mephisto is probably your better bet. However, if you've already pushed high enough for these modes and you need a character to go higher in the world boss legend stages, then Knull is your better option. Regardless of who you pick though, you can see that both are great options, at least for PvE, since they can do stages as high as 124 without a damage proc. In PvP, it's a bit trickier to tell which character you might want to build first, but based on the characters that have risen to the current meta, I would say that Mephisto might have a bit more value in PvP modes, and I'll explain why very shortly. If you want to get an idea of just how good Mephisto is, even at level 60, I was able to take down my top ranked characters of my own team. So that's Sentry with a brilliant regen, and then Silver Surfer and Dormammu with a mighty regen. Even though Silver Surfer managed to take out one of Mephisto's lives, I still had little trouble taking out all three characters, including their second life or their revive. Keep in mind that by having the character at level 60, I suffer a lot of penalties, such as it being harder to hit characters due to the dodge scaling and hitting for less damage due to the damage scaling. There's a bunch of other penalties as well, but those are the main ones. In short, you basically want to take the character to level 70 in max gears if you can, especially if you're going to regularly use them in PvP content like Timeline. Regardless, you can see that the penalties aren't as severe because the character's base stats are so high. I did counteract some of the dodge and hit penalties by adding Wiccan and Ancient One, which provide ignored dodge to Mephisto. To show that the first fight wasn't a fluke, I fight the same team, i.e. my team, and I don't use Wiccan or Ancient One this time for the ignored dodge, but instead I use Red She-Hulk for that damage and HP increase. You can see that even on auto, and again at level 60, he's consistent enough to take out all three of these characters, with two of them having reflect, and all three having an iframe ignore skill. His base damage is really good, and his survival isn't that far off either. He isn't necessarily very tanky, but because his fifth skill is such a long iframe skill, and because it has a short cooldown, he can keep cycling into this and basically not be hit unless the opponent has an iframe ignore skill. However, if the fifth skill hits first, the character is usually locked out of their skills because the fifth skill does have mind control. So essentially, if you're playing the character on manual, you can just cycle between the fifth and the second skill and be permanently in iframes. If you're wondering if the character can take out Jean, which has a high resistance to element damage like fire, I did this other test versus Jean with a Colossus support. And even with her own leadership and the support, Mephisto at level 60 was still able to take her down. An interesting note about his fourth and second skill is that I believe it has immunity to guard break penetration on it. I don't think the entire skill has it, but I do believe that portions of it do, such as the stomp on the fourth skill and when he kind of goes invisible on the second skill. On top of that, his third skill provides him immunity to guard break penetration, such as Jean's fifth skill, which essentially head rocks you even if you have immunity to guard break. If you're in the giant form stance, you can essentially walk out of that fifth skill without being head rocked. As an added bonus, you also get 4 seconds of invincible and a 30% damage increase to heroes. So if you're playing on manual and the situation calls for it, then don't be afraid to go in that stance. Unfortunately, some of the level 70 testing that I had with Mephisto and Lion's Conquest didn't save properly, so I'm only going to show you the 2 clips that did save properly, but they are at level 60. Again, similar to the timeline tests, even though Mephisto is level 60 and suffers from those penalties, he is still able to solo meta characters by himself. You can clearly see that one of the teams that I had good success with was using Red She-Hulk lead for the fire damage increase and the HP increase, and then Wasp for her debuff passive. All that HP increase from Wasp's passive and Red She-Hulk's leadership also works great with regeneration because it increases that HP shield to a very large amount. If you want to use the character with another meta, then the one that I found that works the best is Dormammu. Reason for this is because if you use Mephisto in the leadership position, he grants the fire damage increase to both Dormammu and Mephisto when they're debuffed, and you can further increase that damage if you use a support like Ghost Panther that increases the fire damage even further, or if you use a character like Red She-Hulk to increase the survival of the 2 characters. Besides that, Dormammu also provides Reflect, which makes the team even harder to take down. On top of this, I mentioned earlier that Mephisto might have a bit more value than Knull in PvP, and that's because this team that I just mentioned is a pretty good counter for the Defenders team in Alliance Conquest. Defenders team has risen to the very top of the Alliance Conquest meta and are pretty hard to take down, and this team can do just that. Alternatively, if you build Knull first, then it would be harder to take down this team because Knull not only doesn't iframe too much, but is physical damage and can be directly countered by both Luke Cage and Jessica Jones just from the reflect damage. Daredevil obviously has a type advantage versus Mephisto, but that's why you pair him with a character like Dormammu, which has no type disadvantage because he's universal, and because he can iframe, ignore, and hit Daredevil at any point, and also reflect back all the damage that he does. Other counters you can use to take down an enemy Mephisto are Deadpool, Black Widow, and Rogue. All of them obviously have a type advantage and an iframe ignore skill. Although you saw me take down Jean in Timeline, in Alliance Conquest you generally want to avoid her when using Mephisto, because she has high element resist and she more than likely will stay alive long enough to use her 5th skill and wipe out the rest of your team. Again, sorry I didn't have more Alliance Conquest footage to show here, but I'll make sure that I do for the next videos that I have. All in all, I would say that if you are going to build one of these 2 characters, I would more than likely suggest going with Mephisto first because you'll get the most value from him. You can push in content that requires all defense down, and he does pretty well in content that doesn't require all defense down. Besides that, he's one of the top counters for the top meta teams in Alliance Conquest, and he does pretty well in Timeline too, considering that not many speed types are in the meta for Timeline. And that pretty much wraps up this video. I'm not going to have access to my main editing computer next week, but I'm going to try to do my best to get the testing for the Black Order done as soon as possible and get videos up on that. So if you don't want to miss that, consider subscribing and hitting the bell icon so you're notified when the video's up. If you found this video interesting or informative, consider leaving a like. If you have any questions or comments, make sure to leave them in the comments section below, and I'll do my best to get back to you. As always, thanks for your time and watching, but the video is now over.